Hey, how y'all doing?
Living the dream, just another day in paradise.
Same here.
Well, there you go. Awesome. So you guys were telling me earlier that resources deployed in Azure by default are publicly facing, or maybe some resources in Azure by default are publicly facing. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, so storage accounts, recovery
Mhm.
services vault, and app services are all three public facing by default. The only ones that aren't public facing are SQL databases and SQL managed instance.
Gotcha. Now, when you say those storage accounts, is that the same as like when I read an AWS headline and it's like an AWS S3 bucket was opened by default and now there's a huge data breach? Is that what you're talking about, but on the Azure side of the house?
Yes, when it's created by default, if you don't change it on the networking tab, it will be open to all. So my laptop, your laptop, anyone at RSM, anyone across the world, if they have the right path, they can hit it.
Really? Oh, that's interesting. So we could have clients out there, or, IT leadership out there could have individuals within their company building out these storage accounts or building out these components, and by default, they're just open to the web.
Yes,
So
yes, quite a few.
how do you fix that?
Well, Alex, you want to show us?
You have a handy dandy demo for us today to go over how we can secure our storage accounts and our different PaaS services. So I'll get my screen shared out. So here we are in the Azure portal. You have a storage account built out for us to take a look at. If we go to the networking tab here, we can see there's three different options. So by default, when you create the Azure storage account, it's going to be enabled from all networks,
Mhm.
meaning it's publicly accessible. It's a public endpoint. It's reachable on the internet. There's also an option here to enable it from specific virtual networks inside of your Azure environment. And additionally, you can completely disable the public network access. In that case, you'd be using something like a private endpoint. So to get this started, to kind of test this out, I'm going to go to our Azure container, and I'm just going to upload a simple blob.
Just a simple blob.
So here we can see just a text file, nothing crazy. If I try to download this, I can do so, no problem.
But now, could you give me that URL right there and give that to me and I could download that thing, no problem?
So to start, really, there's kind of two key components. There's the network access, and then there's an authentication piece. So you would need to authenticate as well. However, we're looking for a defense in-depth strategy where we have multiple layers of security. We don't want to
Mhm.
only rely on the identity aspect. We also want to make sure the network is secure as well. So
Gotcha.
one way we can do that is using an Azure Service Endpoint. And how that works is you're specifically locking down your platform as a service offering, such as a storage account, to a specific virtual network and subnet. So I'll
Is
kind
an
of show you how that
Azure
works.
is an Azure service endpoint the same thing as a private endpoint?
So a private endpoint is completely separate. A private endpoint will
Oh.
actually assign a private IP address, a network interface card to that resource, whereas
Mhm.
a service endpoint just allows your subnet to access any of your storage accounts, SQL databases that you specify in your service endpoint. So what
Got
that
it.
looks like here is we can, on the networking tab of the storage account, we can enable from selected virtual networks. And then here I want to add an existing virtual network. So here I'm telling it I want to be able to access this storage account from the virtual network that I'm specifying here. So this is going to enable that service endpoint.
Now we could though, if I've got servers and endpoints on-prem, I could through a
Mhm.
site-to-site VPN connect into Azure through that virtual network, right? And kind of keep it
Not
all with enclosed.
Yeah, so not for the service endpoint. The service endpoint, it only allows it from that virtual network that you specify. But if you're looking to secure this from on-prem or from another cloud that you have a site to site with, that's where you'd use a private endpoint in order to access your platform as a service data.
Got it.
And then we'll wait for this to enable. Looks like it just added there. So now we can see this is locked down specifically to my Azure Virtual Network, my subnet. So now if I go back to, oh, we got to save this first. That's been done. Now, if I go back to the container, I don't have access. So from my computer, I no longer can see the data. I can't download it. It's completely locked down to that Azure Virtual Network.
Interesting.
Now, if we go back to the networking tab, right, this is the virtual network. This is the subnet. I'm going to hop over to a virtual machine that's sitting on this subnet right now. I'm going to pull this over. So here I created this Azure virtual machine. It has this public IP address. I'm logged into the Azure portal from the server itself. I'm just going to refresh here.
Now, that's a public IP address, so other people can hit that remotely?
We have this server locked down via network security group, so it's only accessible
Oh,
from within RSM.
got it.
And then now if we go to the networking tab, we'll just double check confirm. Yep, same configuration. If I go to the storage account container again, we can see the data and I can download it just as I did before. And now this is because I'm inside the virtual network, I'm inside my Azure environment, and that service endpoint is allowing me to secure that path to the data.
Nice.
And that is our first way of doing it. And we also have the private endpoint. So Thomas and Cole, would you like to see how that works as well?
Yeah, because I get those confused, private endpoints versus what we're currently talking about. So help me out there.
Perfect. Yeah, so let's enable a private endpoint. So to start, usually when you enable a private endpoint, you want to completely take your PaaS service, your storage account completely off of, the public endpoint, right? We only want to focus on that private endpoint. So here, we're going to disable public network access. So I'll go ahead and save this. And then now I'm just going to quickly build out a private endpoint, which takes just about a minute here. So I'll give this a name, private endpoint dash, we'll do Azure file. And then for the storage account, you have to select a target sub-resource. So for us, it's going to be a file.
Yeah.
And then this private endpoint, remember, it's going to get assigned a network interface card, a private IP address. So it has to live inside of a virtual network.
Got
So we'll
it.
find our VNet. And there's our subnet. And we'll let it dynamically assign a private IP address. And then for DNS to work properly, Azure is going to create a Azure private DNS zone.
Mm-hmm.
And then we will review and create.
So while that's building, we had a container that was publicly facing, and we said, we don't want this publicly facing. We're going to turn off public access, and we're going to lock that container down to just a subnet in Azure. So as long as you're on that subnet, you can access that container all day long, but
Correct. Yep.
you wouldn't be able to access that container from on-prem, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Then
That's
we
right.
added that private endpoint to it. So now you can access that container on-prem if you wanted to. If we had the site-to-site VPN and all that fun stuff set up, correct?
Yep. As long as your on-prem environment, your other cloud environments have some sort of network private connection to this Azure virtual network, you'll be able to connect to the private endpoint with no problem.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we'll let this
So
deploy.
so while that's deploying though, as an IT leader, how can I go into my environment and check to see what I have that's publicly facing, like publicly available? Is there a way to check that?
Yeah. So, I mean, a great way, like kind of we did on the storage account, just kind of reviewing the environment, doing an assessment of what you have today. So for example, go to your platform as a service, storage account, SQL database, take a look at the networking and see what you have configured. Like here, we can completely see that public network access is disabled. So it's not even reachable from the public internet.
Gotcha. Interesting. So what are some of the pitfalls? Like if I just went in there and turned this thing off for random services, what are the things that I need to watch out for or think about before I do that?
Yeah, so whatever, any applications, any integrations, APIs that might be connecting to these data sources, you'll just want to make sure that you have a seamless transition to using service endpoints or using private endpoints. So kind of just assessing, doing a discovery of what's connecting to the data so that when you do disable public network access, you know what the impact is.
Gotcha. And then as an IT leader, if I find that in my environment I have Azure resources that are public and I'm just like, I don't want any of that to be public anymore, can you guys as RSM help with the assessment piece, the reconfiguration, re-architecture, and then enablement of that service?
Absolutely. That's something we've done for many other customers as well, reviewing the environment, security best practices, ways to optimize the environment. So that's certainly something that we can help with.
Nice, nice, good stuff. What what else? What else do you want to? It's still deploying, isn't it? Yeah.
It's taking a minute here for us. It's getting a private DNS zone. It's creating that network interface card. It's setting up that private connectivity. So it does take a minute here, and it actually just completed. So we'll take a quick look at that. So we're at the storage account. We go to private endpoint connections. We can see that connection listed here. This is our private endpoint, so we can click on that. And as you can see here, here's our DNS configuration. It's using that private DNS zone. It has this private IP address of 10.0.0.5. So our file share that I created there, it's now using this private IP address. And then here's the actual network interface card. And if I go to the virtual network, and I go to connected devices, we're going to be able to see that network interface card sitting here. So you can actually see it's using that private IP address. Now, when I actually go to connect to the data source here, let's go back to the storage account. And if I try to access the data, we don't have access because it's using the private endpoint. I'm not on the Azure network, so I can't see the data. Now, if I go back to my virtual machine here and I pull up, let's do PowerShell, we will go ahead and get connected to the file share. So let's go to our file share. We'll press connect. It's going to give us a handy dandy script here to execute and map our file share. Paste that in. So as you can see, it's doing a testnet connection and it's resolving that fully qualified domain name to the private IP address. So here we can actually map that. So now if we open up File Explorer, we can see our file share, the RSM file, and now we can start moving any data over, creating our directories and using this data source.
Nice. That's pretty cool. Nice.
Yeah. And that is how you create a private endpoint.
Alex,
Very
quick
cool.
question for you. If
Yeah.
you're trying to connect from on-prem, is the setup any different or is the same setup?
So when you're connecting from on-prem, the one consideration there is DNS. When you're looking up the RSM Azure Lab Storage.file.core.windows.net, that has to be reached from within Azure. So your DNS server on-prem is going to have a conditional forwarder to say anything with the file.core.windows.net, forward that to my Azure domain controller to take care of the resolution. Because Azure uses a specific IP address. It's called the Azure Wire server. That's only accessible within Azure. And that's why we have to use a DNS forwarder to resolve that from on-prem.
What's the Azure Wire server? What?
Yeah, so the Azure Wire server, let me actually pull that up here. So the Azure Wire server, it's this special 168.63.129.16 IP address. It is a public IP address that's owned by Microsoft, but it's only accessible from within an Azure environment. So if you want to reach this from on-prem, from other clouds, you're not going to be able to hit this 168 address just because of, its security to the Azure environment.
Got it. Nice. That's awesome. Dude, well,
Yeah,
thank you so much for jumping through that with me. I appreciate that.
absolutely.
So,
Anytime.
if you had to just speak to everyone in the world that had Azure right now, and you had to tell them like one thing that you would want them to check or look at in their Azure environment to help with that security posture, what would it be?
Yeah, a few things would be, using Microsoft Defender for Cloud. That gives you a quick, high-level overview of all of your, security vulnerabilities or maybe ways to optimize your environment. So Microsoft Defender for Cloud is going to be a great start. Additionally, kind of what I showed in the Azure portal, go to your different resources, check out the networking, is public access enabled? And then you kind of look for different ways to secure your environment and make sure you're following best practices.
Nice. All right. Cole, what would you say?
I'd go along with similar route, right? Networking is key to an Azure environment. Everything in Azure can connect to one another. Make sure that you're peering to only what you need to be peered to. Make sure that your connection is going through a firewall, either an Azure firewall or some other Palo Alto, Cisco ASAV, or Meraki or something, right? Direct your traffic purposefully. Make sure that it's just not open to everything and everyone.
Perfect. Awesome. Sweet. Well, thanks guys so much for jumping in this with me. I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. We'll hit you guys up soon. Have a good one.
Thanks for your time.
Later.
Thank you.